I am Frank Clement, Jr. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee today, April the 25th, 2007, for the purpose of interviewing Douglas Murray Fisher. This interview is part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Douglas Murray Fisher, when and where were you born?
I was born in Nashville, Tennessee, August the 12th, 1927.
Were you one of those fortunate enough to be born in a hospital or somewhere else?
I was born in the home of my grandfather.
And who was he?
His name was Newton Murray Tucker.
Who were your parents?
My father was Granville Chapman Fisher. My mother was Roberta Tucker Fisher. She later remarried and was Roberta Tucker Jordan.
What were their professions?
My father retired as chairman of the Department of Psychology at the University of Miami in Miami, Florida. But earlier in his life, he had done a number of things. He had been an architectural draftsman, he had been a minister, he had been an artist designing stage-like sets for parties at a great country club in Miami. He was a man of many parts. My mother was a private teacher of public speaking.
You have historical, if not legendary, ancestry, grandparents and great-grandparents, particularly of Williamson County. Tell us about that.
Well, my grandfather, Newton Murray Tucker, was a Williamson County physician. He finished medical school in 1898, started his practice in a little town in Williamson County known as Duplex, where my mother's birth certificate shows she was born. A little later, he moved to Leaper's Fork, now then known as Hillsborough, Tennessee. And in about 1909, I think it was, he was one of the incorporators of the town of Leaper's Fork, and he was the first physician of that little town. Have a newspaper article welcoming him to Leaper's Fork. He practiced in Williamson County until 1920 when he moved to Nashville. And I was born in his house out in West Nashville. He was named for a Confederate Army surgeon, also named Newton Tucker. And his grandfather was a Williamson County physician named Nicholas Murray, after whom, from whom I got my middle name. He was a member of the 8th Tennessee Cavalry Regiment in the Civil War. My maternal grandmother's father was a man named Robert Cotton, and he was in the 4th Tennessee Cavalry Regiment in the Civil War. He later was transferred to the Secret Service and became a member of Coleman's Scouts. Coleman's Scouts was a group of young, single Middle Tennessee men who worked as couriers and spies for General Bragg. Sam Davis, one of them. Sam Davis was captured and hung, as you know. Robert was captured. He was imprisoned in Rock Island, Illinois for nearly 2 years. And while he was there, he kept a journal. He would write down he would copy all the letters that were sent to him. He would send letters home. They were permitted one-page letters. And earlier this year, the Williamson County Historical Society published his complete journal, writing to some young ladies back home. He was unlucky in love. One of them married a Union officer. Another one went into the nunnery at St. Cecilia's. He returned after he was pardoned after the war. He returned to Franklin and became a farmer. I suppose those are all of the relatives that I think of at the moment.
Have you mentioned your paternal grandfather, Harry Gordon Fisher?
No, my father's father was named Harry Gordon Fisher. He moved to Florida when I was a small child. He worked for a railroad. I don't know what he did. He had an office job. I don't know which railroad. I saw him once when I was 7 years old. Or later. When he retired, he bought a lake up in North Florida near Palatka, built a little house on the lake. He said that he spent a lot of time fishing. Although I didn't see him when I was growing up, he would send me books. I remember he wrote in the front of one of the books, said, the Russians claim they can change human nature, but they can't.
Tell us about your early childhood.
Well, I had quite an unusual childhood, I would say. After the stock market crash in 1929, I was born in 1927. And shortly after the stock market crash in 1940 and 1929, my parents were divorced. And my father moved to Miami, Florida, along with his father, his mother, and 4 of his brothers. The time I was 7 years old, I had lived with my father in Miami, where I attended the 1st grade. And I had lived with my mother in my grandparents' house in West Nashville. My mother had aspired to be an actress. She had gone to college at Ward Belmont, which at that time was a ladies' college in Nashville, and later she studied at the American Academy of Dramatic Art in New York City. But she was home. She was a young single mother, and here she was with me.
She was a great influence on you as you became a young teenage boy. She was a teacher, particularly a great role model, and also a nationally renowned speech and debate teacher.
She was. In my early childhood, though, to go back, I had some very good experiences as a result of the fact that she had this training as an actress. There was a wonderful summer camp up on the Cumberland plateau near Sparta called Camp Bon Air. And it was run by the YMCA in Nashville. My mother was hired to put on dramatic productions at the camp. And there was a girls' camp and a boys' camp about a mile apart. I saw her only at meals when the girls would be leaving the mess hall and the boys would be coming in. And I was 6 years old at the time. And I was the smallest child at the camp. I learned to ride. Some of the campers had brought their horses and their ponies. I learned to swim. I even learned to shoot a rifle. I wasn't old enough to work in the woodworking shop. I wasn't large enough to swing a tennis racket. They had all of those wonderful things at the camp. Another summer, my mother was a member of what they called a stock company. And that company put on productions in Ridgetop, Tennessee, at a place called the Old Barn Theater. Dinah Shore was a member of that stock company. Her name was Fannie Rose Shore at the time. I remember she gave me candy once. Another summer, I lived with relatives out in Franklin. So I had quite a diverse childhood.
Where did you go to high school, and what were those years like?
Well, those were wonderful years for me. I graduated from the West End High School out in the western part of Nashville. In my junior year in high school, I started competing in speech contests that were sponsored by the National Forensic League. My mother was very familiar with the National Forensic League. She had many students who competed in their speech contests. And they would have local contests and regional contests, statewide contests. And her students would compete in original oratory and declamation, dramatic readings, humorous readings. And she got me into all of that. And she worked on me. She made me practice and practice and practice. And I won a lot of contests in my junior year. I think that partially as a result of that work, I was chosen as a senator from Tennessee for the National Student Congress, which was held in Columbus, Ohio. And I was also chosen to attend Boys State, which was held up at Castle Heights Military Academy in the summer after school was out. It was an exercise in trying to teach young high school boys about government, state government. At Boys State, I ran for governor. I lost the primary by 1 vote, but I won the oratorical contest. At Columbus, Ohio, I didn't distinguish myself in any way. Before I went to the National Student Congress, I thought I might need to make a speech. I didn't have any good ideas about what to speak about, but I'd been reading in the Tennessean some editorials about abolishing the poll tax, which at that time was a tax designed, frankly, to keep African Americans from voting, and I thought abolishing the poll tax was a great idea. I went to the Tennessean and I asked to see whoever was writing those editorials. Thought I might get some pointers on how to write a speech. And somebody introduced me to Jennings Perry, who was the editor, one of the editors. And Mr. Perry listened to me, and I told him I wanted some help in writing a speech, and wondered if he could give me some materials or something to. And Mr. Perry took out a piece of paper, put it in his typewriter, and he wrote me a little speech right on the spot and handed it to me. And but I never did get to make the speech. I was confused when I got up to the National Student Congress, and by the time it took me, by the time it was over, to figure out what was going on. I never got on the floor. When I came back, Mr. Perry called me up and offered me a job as a copy boy at Tennessean, the Nashville, Tennessean. I was a high school senior by that time. I had taken most of the courses that I needed to take. I had run out of things to take almost, so I took a course in typing. Turned out to be the best course I ever took. But I was out of school by 1 o'clock. And I would go to the Tennessean down on Lower Broadway, down on 1100 Broadway, after school, to work as a copy boy. And I was thrilled.
I assume the initial visit with Mr. Perry was your introduction to the paper.
Right. I hadn't known him. I didn't know who to ask for. But I felt like I was in the adult world. Sat around the city room between errands, and all those reporters knew everything. They knew about politics, they knew about sports, they knew about the crime, it was a very exciting environment.
What were the responsibilities of a copy boy at that time?
Running errands. When they needed a sandwich, I'd go get them a sandwich, and I would take copy from one reporter and hand it to an editor. I would pull a copy off of what we called a telecopier, an Associated Press machine where the copy came in from wire services, and United Press also at that time. Tom Little, who was the cartoonist, also sold some of his cartoons to a Chicago newspaper, and I'd wrap up his cartoons and put them in the mail for him. Just anything they could think of that a young squirt could do.
And were you still in high school at this time?
I was. And I didn't have time to get into any trouble. I went right from school to the paper and worked there. Sometimes I would work until very late at night. I had an old rattletrap automobile that I had bought with summer savings. I remember I bought it for $115, a 1932 Chevrolet. When I went into the Navy, I sold it for $90 and drove it 2 years, so you know I could get back and forth to work. That was just such a rich experience.
Let's go back to your high school debate and speech activities. I understand you were extremely successful, winning local, regional, and even competing in national oratory competition.
I won a lot of contests. The most important contest that I won was, I didn't really win. I had heard about a competition that the American Legion sponsored on a nationwide basis, and I think they still do this. They've done it for many, many years, in which a high school student composes and makes a speech about the United States Constitution. And they will have a local contest, winding up at stages in a statewide contest, sectional contest, regional contest, and finally there are 4 finalists in the national contest. 1 from the southeast, 1 from the northeast, northwest, southwest. And I won all of the competitions up to the national finals. The national finals were held in Buffalo, New York in my senior year in high school. In the national finals, you gave your original speech, and then you also gave an impromptu speech on some section of the Constitution or the Bill of Rights that they pulled out of a hat for each of the 4 speakers. Well, knowing that that was coming up, that got me to reading The Federalist, the papers that were written by Hamilton and Madison, largely in support of the adoption of the Constitution. And I thought they were very, very interesting. I won 2nd place in the national contest. That was just a very fortunate thing for me. It carried some prize money. Each of the 4 finalists got prize money as a result of the contest. I recently heard the prize money is now $40,000 apiece. It was a lot less at my time, but it was enough to pay for 2 years of tuition at Vanderbilt, where I eventually enrolled. And the Legion also told each one of the 4 finalists they could get us appointments to one of the service academies if we could qualify. And I thought that was just a great thing, except I knew that would involve a lot of math. And I had no interest in mathematics. It was sort of a reckless thing to throw away the chance to go to college free. But I had decided I wanted to be a lawyer.
What influenced you at that early stage in your life to want to be a lawyer?
I have wondered about that. I think it was almost inevitable I was going to be a lawyer. I wanted a job, and I was trying to think of something I could do. I had the idea that lawyers wrote and spoke, and I was writing, I was speaking, and I couldn't think of anything else I could do. I didn't have any particular skills. I knew one lawyer, Weldon White, very distinguished Nashville lawyer. He had been the best man. He later told me, once I was grown, I didn't know that. He told me he had been the best man at my parents' wedding. But I knew him as a teenager, and as a teenager, he gave me my first cigar.
Do you consider that a good influence or a not so good influence?
Well, it may have made me think that lawyers were fine people. I don't know. But Weldon White, he was an impressive man. He ran for mayor later, and I went around in a sound truck making speeches for him as a teenager. But I simply wanted a job, and I thought I could maybe do the work. I did not. A lot of young lawyers now, I hear them say, I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to help somebody. I didn't have any of those ideas. I wanted a job.
It was, you were a child of the Depression, and
I was.
It was an era immediately before World War II or America's involvement.
That's right.
You received the benefit of the 2-year scholarship, and you applied to Vanderbilt University, but did you go to Vanderbilt straight out of high school, or did you go in a slightly different direction?
The day before my 18th birthday, in August of 1945, I enlisted in the Navy. Enlisted means going down and signing up. They didn't take me immediately. I signed up also at Vanderbilt, and actually started at Vanderbilt. And then I have to tell you an embarrassing story. I had never been in a college situation before. It was rush week. Fraternities were having a lot of parties. I had such a good time. And shortly after I enrolled in Vanderbilt, there was some tests coming up, and I realized I had gotten through high school by cramming. I was not a consistent, dedicated student, and I had no trouble passing by cramming, but some tests were coming up, and I was supposed to have read a number of books for some tests. And I suddenly realized it's not humanly possible for me to read these books in time for the test. I went back down to the recruiting station. The Navy recruiter was a gentleman I had met in high school. He had been the principal at East Nashville High School, and I'd met him during some speech contests. Said, "Mr. Oliver, can you get me in the Navy right now?" And he did. So I left the Navy shortly after signing up at Vanderbilt in order to avoid disgracing myself academically. And it was a wonderful move. Vanderbilt refunded my tuition, so I didn't lose any of my scholarship money. You know, Vanderbilt, like everybody else, very patriotic at that time. Keep in mind, the war was over. On the 11th, when I signed up, on the 11th of August in 1945, the bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Germans had quit fighting in May. And about 3 days after I enlisted, the Japanese quit fighting, and the following month, the formal surrender occurred. So I was never in any danger in the Navy. Went to San Diego, California, with what turned out to be the last company that they trained at the United States Naval Training Center for a while. Actually, somebody in Washington should have figured out they didn't need any more sailors, but it took them about a year to do that. And I had what amounted to a wonderful year in sunny San Diego, California. In the Navy.
I trust that gave you not only the opportunity to mature a little bit, but to obtain the benefit of the GI Bill for educational purposes.
That was an unexpected benefit of what could have been my academic disaster. Yes, I came back after about a year, came back to Vanderbilt in time to start the next fall with the GI Bill. And the GI Bill at that time provided for support in college for however many months you had been in the service, plus a year. So with the GI Bill and the scholarship from the American Legion, I got all the way through academic school at Vanderbilt and got started into law school. I had no money except for those.
What were your years like in the undergraduate or academic studies at Vanderbilt?
Well, first let me say they were wonderful. I had such a good time at Vanderbilt. I joined the Sigma Chi fraternity. I got involved in campus politics. I became president of a campus political organization known as the Student Progressive Organization.
Some people might call that a political boss these days, if I understand how it worked.
I've laughed about that since then. It was anything except progressive. We had a combine of several fraternities that could muster about 500 and some odd votes. Not nearly enough to control an election, but a big enough block so that if we voted as a block, and if we had good candidates who could attract votes independently, we could virtually control the elections for class officers, which we did. We would auction off the offices at a meeting of the fraternities, political representatives. Each fraternity had points. Points were determined by the number of members of your fraternity, so that a large fraternity, could in time have probably more officers than the small ones, but the small ones also could bid. We enforced discipline at the polls after a fashion. we could not, of course, tell how any member of the fraternities voted, but we could sure tell if they got there. And if they didn't get to the polls, their fraternity would be penalized in its points so that they would have a dry spell on offices. And one absence of one member cost them dearly. So we never had, that I remember, a single member of one of our fraternities who failed to show up at each election.
Is it correct that near the end of the day of each election, you would identify which fraternities and which member in a fraternity had not yet voted and send out the alert to get them to the polls?
Well, no, not quite. We never had to send out. We had poll checkers at the polls, and I don't recall anybody who ever failed to show up and had to be summoned. We had a rule that we never had to put into play, that if you were in the hospital, you get brought over on a stretcher. Nobody ever did. I guess nobody was sick on election day, but we never had anybody that we identified that failed to show up at the polls. And we won and won and won.
What drew you to politics?
Just the fact that the contest was there. The Student Progressive Organization had been started a year before I was president by another fraternity brother of mine who recruited me to step into his shoes when he graduated. And so I stepped into my ready-made job. That was interesting. I was elected president of the Honor Council at Vanderbilt. The Honor Council would try students accused of cheating and decide on discipline, expulsion, and whatnot. I won the Founders Medal in Oratory, which was just a continuation of my speaking exercises. And then at the end of the third year of academic school, I entered the law school. There was a program at Vanderbilt at that time called the Senior in Absentia program. I think it was devised for the benefit of veterans who were anxious to get on with their lives. Vanderbilt would pretend, sort of, after your first year of law school that you had completed 4 years of academic school, and they would award you your bachelor's degree, although you really had not completed the fourth year. And then you would get your law degree after 3 years in law school. You could enter the seniors in absentia program if you had taken a large number of hours during your first 3 years, which is the only requirement that I remember.
You mentioned that money was tight and that you were able to go to school because of the 2 financial grants. Were you working during this time to go to college and law school?
In the summers, I worked as a lifeguard at a swimming pool in Williamson County out in Franklin known as Willow Plunge, a job that I would have paid to have if I had had any money. The pay was $25 a week. It was a 70-hour week. Work from 8 in the morning till 6 at night, 7 days a week. So we lived at the pool. And I did save virtually all of my $25 a week. I would eat at the little snack shack out at the pool. I would sleep in the locker room. Have dates at night after the pool closed at the pool. And I made extra money by teaching swimming in the mornings on weekdays when the crowds were thin. Made more money teaching swimming than I did as my pay as a lifeguard. But all of the beautiful women in Franklin, Nashville came out to Franklin. It was the place to go. And had a grassy sloping bank leading down to the pool, and all of the pretty women that I knew just came out there very often. It was a social center. Great job.
Did you continue to work for the paper while you were going to Vanderbilt?
I failed to tell you, I guess, that at the Tennessean, when I was a copy boy, I had a little experience as a sports writer. John Bibb later became sports editor of the Nashville Tennessean, but while I was working as a copy boy, John went off to war. The sports editor, Raymond Johnson, recruited me to work for him in the sports department. I lost my copy boy job and became a member of the staff of the sports department. My job initially was to answer the telephone. People would call up sports department and they would say, they would want to know how many bases did Honus Wagner steal in his lifetime? They'd want to know how did Roy Welch get to be world's light heavyweight wrestling champion? And I was supposed to find the answers to their questions and call them back. I knew virtually nothing about sports. I had never been a member of an organized athletic team. I had, I guess the reason Raymond Johnson recruited me, I had handed in a couple of volunteer articles to the sports department, which they had published, about some of my friends who were athletes in the sports department. For a brief time, I got to cover a few high school athletic events. I got bylines, and I called myself a sports writer. But that ended when I volunteered for the Navy. That ended before I'd started in college. In law school, however, just as my money ran out from the scholarship and from the GI Bill, an editor of the Nashville Banner, a rival paper of the Tennessean, had read a fraternity newspaper that I put out. And as a result, he called me and asked me if I would like to go to work for the Banner. And that was a gift out of heaven. I started working for the Banner as a daily columnist. At that time, James D. Stallman, who was the publisher of the Banner, was on the board of trust at Vanderbilt and was very interested in the school, as was Charles Moss, the editor who called me. And so I did a daily column about Vanderbilt, things going on at Vanderbilt. It was called the Vanderbilt Vigil. I could write about anything I wanted to. I could write about a particular teacher or an issue that the Board of Trust was dealing with, or I could write about an athletic event, or campus gossip, anything I wanted to. And so I did that for quite a long time. And then Mr. Moss invited me to work full-time for the Banner in the summers in law school. Banner was an afternoon newspaper, so the daytime work was what most of the people at the Banner did. So I became a staff, what they called a staff writer. Other people would say a reporter for the Banner. In the summertime, various regular staffers of the Banner would take their vacations, and I would fill in for them on their regular beats. A reporter named Dick Battle covered the city government, county government, and one named Leslie Hart covered politics on Capitol Hill. Other reporters covered the police station and crime. And I would fill in for them, and I got to meet a lot of the officials who were active in city and county government and on Capitol Hill. When school started back up, Charles Moss, the editor, created for me a night job at the Banner. The Banner staffers worked during the daytime, typically, but things were always going on around town at night. So I'd go to law school in the day, and I would go to work at the Banner at night. And one night I might cover a meeting of the city council, another night I might cover the school board, might cover a future farmer's banquet, a retirement banquet for somebody. I got a number of good free meals that night. If there's nothing else going on, I would write obituaries. I got to know by heart the telephone numbers of each funeral home in town, and when no crime scene to visit and no meeting to cover, I'd just start calling the funeral homes, see who died, and then I'd call the families and get information for obituaries. At that time, the newspaper published a lot of unpaid obituaries, unlike now. Most of the obituaries now are paid for. But at that time, they were both paid for and free.
I assumed you studied on occasion. Sounds like you were working rather diligently.
I was not the best law student. I did well enough, but I cut class frequently.
I understand that drew the ire of a legendary Professor Hartman, who's taught there for 30 plus years.
Paul Hartman. I have forgotten what class I had with him, but I cut it pretty frequently. The reason I would cut class, sometimes I'd have daytime assignments at the newspaper if I could take them. Other times I was just tired from working the night before. And I figured I didn't need to go to class. I would borrow the notes of some very good students who'd had the same class the year before. And one of them had been one of them took shorthand and had been a secretary in the Waves. And she had perfect notes. She would take them in shorthand and then write them out in longhand. And we had been told, my class, that attendance was up to us. In other words, it's going to be very entrepreneurial. But the whole grade was going to be on the final examination. Either you made it or you didn't, and they didn't care how you got the information. So I took that to heart and cut liberally. But getting back to Professor Hartman, he called on me in class one day, and I wasn't there. And I had cut his class before. And one of my classmates told me that Professor Hartman said, Fisher has as much chance of passing this course as a celluloid rat chased through hell by an asbestos cat. Well, that got my attention. I did go to some of his other classes, and I passed his course.
I understand the rat got through hell.
Yes.
Were there any professors that had a significant influence on your career?
Well, of course, they all enabled me to pass the bar examination. My favorite professor was Dean John Wade, who was a national authority in the field of torts. I enjoyed his class. He was a good friend. And he was, I thought, the best professor that I had. But I also would like to point out that at that time, the law school was starting up right after the war. They had very little money. They had a lot of help in two ways: getting by on a small budget. They invited lawyers from downtown to come out and teach. And some of the best teachers that I had at the Vanderbilt Law School were practicing lawyers who came out there from downtown and taught courses. Bob Sturdivant was one, Edwin Hunt, Cecil Sims, Mr. William Waller, Pascal Davis. They were wonderful. And they also were able, for a nickel or two, to get professors from the great Eastern law schools who had reached mandatory retirement. They had their pensions, and they'd come down to Vanderbilt and teach for a few more years. One of them was a famous evidence authority named Eddie Morgan, who had been the acting dean at the Harvard Law School and is credited with having virtually written the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. He was a great evidence authority, but I could not get a thing from him in class. Later, after I was out of law school, he published an evidence book that was greatly useful to me in my practice. But in class, he would talk about the most esoteric areas of evidence that interested him, but never, it seemed to me, touch on the basics.
When did you graduate from Vanderbilt Law School?
Summer of 1952.
How many were in your graduating class?
I can't give you an accurate figure, but I think there were maybe about 70.
Were any of them females?
Not in my class. There were 2 females in the law school while I was there. One of them is the lady I told you about who took such wonderful shorthand notes. Her name was Bonnie Cowan. She was married to another law student, Bob Cowan.
Was there any diversity in your law school class?
we did not have any African Americans or any minorities at that time.
Who are some of the notable graduates of your class?
Still practicing, I can think of only one, who is Jack Madden. Another graduate of my class that I thought was a very fine lawyer was Alf Adams, who is now retired. And a member of my class, two members of my class I'm mighty proud of for their generosity to Vanderbilt. One of them was Herman Lowenstein. I understand he left to Vanderbilt more than $1 million. Another was John Bell Keeble, who went to Atlanta and did not continue in the law practice, although he started with a wonderful Atlanta law firm. But shortly before he died, John Bell gave the law school $500,000. I'm particularly conscious of that because I have over the years tried to recruit a little money for the law school, and except for those two generous gifts, my class must go down as the most parsimonious class that ever graduated from school.
What year did you graduate?
52.
Earlier, I asked about your ancestral family, but I failed to afford you the opportunity to tell us about your wife and children.
My wife is Julie Fisher. Julie took up with me about 30 years ago. We both were divorced at that time. I had two children by a former marriage. My son, Douglas Murray Fisher, Jr., called Murray, and my son, Austin Fisher. Julie had a daughter, Rachel, now grown, and lives close to us in Franklin, Tennessee. Presented us with two fine grandchildren just now with whom we enjoy spending time.
And Julie's maiden name?
Her maiden name was Gasser, called Gasser in Nashville. It's a Swiss name, Swiss-German name, meaning little street. You've heard of Strasse streets. Gasser streets were little streets. Anyway, Julie's maiden name was Gasser.
And you and she reside in an ancestral home of yours in Franklin.
We live in the home of my great-grandfather, Robert Cotton, a Civil War scout that I told you about, downtown, smack downtown in Nashville. An old 1833 house that was an old house when Robert moved into it, which was about 1900 as best we can tell.
Let's return to 1952. You have just graduated from the Vanderbilt Law School. Tell us about the economic environment for young law graduates and what the legal profession was like and how one would get into it with the law degree.
Well, I'll tell you first what Cecil Sims, a fine Nashville lawyer, told a group of law students at Vanderbilt. He said, "Boys, don't even think about practicing law in Nashville, Tennessee." He said, "Nashville is a son-in-law town. And unless you're a son-in-law, it's going to be mighty hard for you to get a job. Go back to wherever you're from. Go back to Pulaski or Tullahoma or Centerville or wherever. And if you can't find a job there, run for the legislature. So it doesn't matter whether you win or lose. You get your name known, and maybe you'll get a client. And that was the environment. The law firms in Nashville were, on the whole, small. Certainly by today's comparison, the largest law firm in Nashville when I finished school was 12 people. And the word on the street was in Nashville that it's a mistake to go to work for a large law firm, because you'll never make any money till the old men die off. They will not pay you. The best job that I know of that anyone in my class got for a salary was $125 at one of the large Nashville law firms, and I was earning more than that on my very modest pay at the Banner.
And the 125, was that per week or per month?
That was a month. There just was not the demand for lawyers that is so obvious today. And the old man in the law firm wanted to keep most of the money. That was another thing. They knew that young lawyers were a dime a dozen, and they could, hire them very cheaply.
Well, with this barren environment, what did you do?
Well, I was puzzled about how to get started. I did have a good job at the Banner as I finished law school. I thought of it as a wonderful job, as a matter of fact. But I told Charlie Moss, the editor, that I would be leaving to try to go into law practice. I didn't have a job when I had that conversation with him. He said, well, the Tennessee will be having a limited constitutional convention in 1953. And that would be a wonderful opportunity for a young lawyer, would-be lawyer, to observe that convention. And if you'll stay on at the Banner, you can help Leslie Hart, who was the chief political writer for the Banner. You can help him report on the 1953 convention, and you will get to meet all the delegates, and it'll just be a great experience for you. And so that sounded pretty good, particularly since I didn't have a job. And I said, I will. And I got to cover the legislature as well with Les Hart. That was after Governor Clement had been elected in 1952. So in covering the legislature and the convention, I met a lot of people on Capitol Hill, which I thought would be a great benefit to a young lawyer, and it was. But after the 1953 convention was over, I spoke with Les Hart and said, where do you think I ought to try to get a job? Les was a very knowledgeable man who knew a lot of lawyers, a lot of politicians, and he said, what you should do, he had a ready answer. He said, what you should do is try to get a job with Robert Clement, the father of the governor. He said, I know that Frank Clement has left the office, and they might have an extra desk down there, And that would be a good connection for you to have. And that sounded pretty good. So I went and talked with Robert Clement, who he was a Dixon, Tennessee lawyer, but he had an office in Nashville, and he had a brilliant young associate named Val Sanford. I had known Val Sanford as a result of having taken a bar exam cram course, sort of extracurricular course at Vanderbilt Law School taught by some recent graduates. And it was a great help and helped me pass the bar examination, no doubt. But there was Val Sanford working with Robert Clement, and it turned out they did have a little extra space in the office, and I went to Mr. Clement and told him I wanted to go to work for him. I said, I know you may not need another lawyer. I don't know whether you do or not, but I'll work for you free. And I'll work at the Banner at night. He said yes.
What did you do for Robert Clement and Val Sanford in that the early months?
Nothing important. I would go with Robert Clement down to Charlotte, Tennessee occasionally. Judge William Pereira was the circuit judge down there at that time, and I got appointed on a few minor cases to defend small-time offenders.
I understand you had a famous chicken thief case.
You know, it's a mistake to turn a young lawyer loose on an unsuspecting criminal defense client. And I defended a young black man who had stolen a chicken off of a train. I can't imagine a train load of chickens, but there was one, and he had taken a chicken. And I was appointed to defend him on the day that he was to be tried, and had only about 5 minutes to have a conversation with him before I was supposed to start defending him. And I couldn't think of a defense. He had stolen the chicken, and he said so. I thought, what can I do? So I thought, I had heard of defense of mental incompetence. So I thought, well, maybe I can get him off if I can prove that he's mentally incompetent. He was kind of slow talking. And so I asked Judge Pereira if I couldn't have him evaluated to see if he was competent to have committed this crime. That was a terrible mistake. Judge Pereira sent him somewhere to get evaluated, and by the time he got back, he could have served 2 sentences for what he had done. And I don't even remember what the evaluation was, but I don't think he had to serve any extra time. Mr. Clement would give me some small tort cases or collection cases, and would allow me to keep half of the fee. Of course, he paid for my overhead, provided secretarial service, and I got half the fee for anything that I might bring in. I remember I had one defense for a drunk driving client. And there again, I made another terrible mistake. I demanded a jury trial for driving under the influence. I didn't know at that time that juries were not as liberal as judges sometimes. And there had just been a change in the law that allowed a defendant to have the jury fix the sentence rather than the judge. And I thought that sounded like a good idea. Juries are supposed to be liberal with, everybody likes the idea of being tried by a jury. This defendant had told an unlikely story. When he had been arrested, he said he was so nervous after an accident that he had that he had a bottle of whiskey in the car with him, and just to calm his nerves, he drank the half pint of whiskey or so, and he was intoxicated when the officers arrived. Well, the jury sentenced that poor fellow. They didn't believe him, of course, and they sentenced him to 6 months on his DUI conviction. And he was a working man from out of state who just happened to be passing through the state. And he had to serve his time, and I later learned I should have asked what the customary sentence was. The judge would have given him a much shorter sentence and maybe probation on his first offense. But there again, that's the way you learn as a young lawyer, I'm afraid, and sometimes at the expense of your clients.
Is it at this point that you start as a part-time prosecutor for Davidson County, or is that later on?
That was later.
All right. What occurs next? You're working with Val Sanford and Robert Clement. Where do you go from there?
Well, I'm working with them, and I'm still working at the manor at night. The 53 convention is over, so I have my lawyer job in the daytime, and I have my night job at the manor. 1954 election season is coming up, and I'm assisting Leslie Hart, the chief political writer, and starting to cover election stories. And very busy, and I got to write several election stories, and I got my own byline, and they were about the 1954 re-election race of Governor Frank Clement, who was again opposed by Gordon Browning, a former governor. And after writing several stories about the campaign, I was invited by Governor Clement and his campaign manager, Buford Ellington, to become publicity director, as it then was called, for the re-election campaign of Governor Clement. I think that was because I had, as a result of my work for the Banner, I'd gotten well acquainted with the reporters from newspapers across the state who covered Capitol Hill. We called them the Capitol Hill Press Corps. And I guess they liked my work at the Banner. So I started working in the campaign, working mostly under the direction and working day and night really in the campaign with Buford Ellington, who later became governor. Our campaign quarters were in the Hermitage Hotel, and I would often sleep at the hotel. And I traveled around the state with Buford Ellington quite a bit. My duties in the campaign were to write news articles to submit to papers all over the state. You appoint a campaign manager in a particular county, and you write an article about him and send it to the local newspaper to get published. Worked with advertising agents on campaign literature. We had a big direct mail operation to people we hoped would be campaign supporters. Worked on scheduling speeches. Governor Clement, as was the custom at the time, would visit all the rural counties and make a speech on the courthouse square. And they had to be coordinated. I would round up musicians for those speeches. To draw the crowd to hear the speech, it was a good idea to have some musicians.
And most of them were Grand Ole Opry stars?
They were, and there's a story that goes with that I just got to tell you. We had big names at these county seat rallies. I remember Eddie Arnold at the rally out in Franklin, and Eddie would entertain the crowd, and he had a bunch of backup musicians. But Eddie was free, and every star that we had was free. The Tennessean couldn't believe it. They wrote some articles challenging the idea that it was possible for us to get these opera stars to perform free, and they never knew why we did. We did pay the backup musicians. We paid them union scale. BMI, Broadcast Music Incorporated, is a performing rights society that collects royalties for musicians. Francis Preston was a leader in BMI at that time, with an office in Nashville. BMI had a tough problem in Washington, D.C. Its rival royalty collection agency, Performing Rights Society, was ASCAP, American Society of Composers and Publishers, I think. And ASCAP promoted and played a lot of traditional music. Think of Cole Porter, Rodgers and Hammerstein. On the other hand, BMI had a lot of country musicians, and it was hard to get them airtime. BMI began buying radio stations to get the country performers on the air. And there was a move in Congress by ASCAP to try to outlaw the practice. Francis Preston came to Governor Clement for help during his first term of office. That was not really Governor Clement's bailiwick, Washington, D.C., you know. You'd think you'd go to your senator, you go to your congressman. And he could easily have sidestepped getting involved in that fight in behalf of Nashville's country musicians. But Governor Clement loved a challenge, and he got on the telephone. And he really worked the telephones in behalf of the country musicians. And that move by ASCAP was defeated, or withdrawn, I've forgotten which. But as a result, Francis Preston and BMI owed Governor Clement some big favors. And in that campaign, we collected. I didn't have to solicit the great performers who entertained at the county seat rallies. Francis Preston lined them up and called them and said, "You will appear at this rally or that rally for Governor Clement," and they did cheerfully, and they drew great crowds.
Well, as a result of your efforts and Buford Ellington and others, Governor Clement was re-elected. What role do you take after that?
Well, I want to also point out he was re-elected by a landslide. He won in 94 of the 95 counties. After the election, Governor Clement invited me to work in his office. I readily accepted. He gave me a grand-sounding title that was totally inappropriate for my level of experience. I was executive counsel to the governor. That was a title that Casey Pentecost, who had worked for him during his first term, had. And Casey went over to the Public Service Commission, and I think maybe it was called the Railroad and Public Utilities Commission at the time. But I became executive counsel to the governor. Now, he didn't really expect me to counsel him. I was 28 years old. I had virtually no significant experience. But he did expect me to continue doing the sort of things I'd been doing during the campaign. I worked on scheduling speeches. I prepared press releases. I was, in effect, press secretary for the governor. Worked with the Capitol Hill News Corps. I was sort of a runner between the governor's office and the attorney general's office, and although I wasn't a real advisor to the governor, I could do some informal running back and forth and give him their thoughts on some things that weren't necessarily to be put in a formal opinion. On matters of pardon and that sort of thing, he would occasionally have me read a trial record before he decided what to do about an application for a pardon, and I would do that. I think the most useful thing that I did for him was during legislative sessions. He would have a meeting every morning during the legislature with his speakers and floor leaders. The legislature would start at 10 in the morning, and he would meet with them at 8 o'clock. At that meeting, they would discuss everything that was going to happen on the floor of the legislature that day. If there had been a new bill introduced the day before, they would discuss what to do with it. Governor Clement had, in effect, gotten people favorable to him appointed as the chair of every committee in both houses. If they wanted to kill the bill, they'd just decide to refer it to this committee or that, where they knew it would never see the light of day. They carefully considered every bill except a few local coondog bills and such, but the administration itself, Governor Clement's cabinet members, had sponsored a number of the bills. And those bills, of course, everybody knew we wanted those bills to pass, and they would be labeled A bills. Somebody else introduced a good bill, they would be labeled B bills, meaning not our idea, but we will support those bills and help get them passed. If they didn't care what happened to the bill, they'd be labeled a C bill, and they simply not take any active role on the bill. If there were a bill they wanted to defeat, be labeled a D bill, and it would be referred to committee and never be seen again. My job for that morning meeting was to prepare on a 8x5 index card a summary of every bill that had been introduced the day before. And also, in that summary, if it was a change in an existing law, to have a little paragraph, the existing law says so-and-so, and this will result in this change, and all that was to be on no more than an 8x5 card. On those cards, they'd be marked A, B, C, and D during the meeting, and the floor leaders and speakers would take those cards up with them to the floor so they would be reminded of what to do with each bill. That way, Governor Clement absolutely almost controlled what would happen in the legislature. The legislature was, of course, a separate branch of government, but in effect, Governor Clement ran the legislature through trusted lieutenants who were the speakers and floor leaders.
Does that practice continue to this day?
Governor Clement was the last strong governor who controlled the legislature. At that time, the legislators, they were a different breed. They didn't have the equipment that they now have. They didn't have secretaries. They didn't have offices. A lot of them were county seat lawyers who came to Nashville 75 days every 2 years for $4 a day. They weren't in it for the money. A lot of them came to have a good time. And they were thoughtful people. But that practice of carefully planning every day what was going to happen was the way that he controlled what happened. It was very hard work for me, but very rewarding. Particularly on Tuesday morning, it was hard because the legislators wouldn't come in until Monday night. They didn't have a Monday morning session. And I'd have to sit up most of the night. All the bills that came in Monday night, getting them digested for the Tuesday morning meeting. And during the week, I often have to get up to Capitol Hill before daylight to be sure all that stuff was done in time. I had a wonderful secretary who did not mind working odd hours, and that also helped make that possible. That practice fell out of, I'd say fell out of favor. Governor Ellington, who succeeded Governor Clement after his second term of office, did continue that practice for a while, and I did the same chore for Governor Ellington at that time, although I by then was in private practice and was hired as special counsel to the governor and the floor leaders and so on, just to do that chore. But Governor Ellington was not as passionate about controlling what happened in the legislature as Governor Clement was. And after a time, those meetings became irregular. Governor Clement, Governor Ellington was not feeling well some of the time, and he just sort of let that practice wither away. And the legislature began to feel its oats. They started appropriating themselves money for secretaries and offices, and things have never been the same since. And money, salaries, pensions.
Governor Clement went out of office in January of 1959. Is that when you entered on a more permanent basis the private practice of law?
Governor Clement invited Val Sanford and me to join him in a new law firm that was called Clement, Sanford, and Fisher. We both readily accepted, and we practiced in that firm under that name for the next 4 years. We first started to lease an office in the then brand new Life and Casualty Tower. But Sam Fleming, who was the president of the Third National Bank, put us on a very welcome retainer, although we were not the principal law firm for the bank. And we thought we'd better be in that bank building, so we started practicing in the old Third National Bank building at 4th and Church. I was the youngest partner. We had some good work. I got a lot of work researching titles, largely for the Guarantee Mortgage Company. That was lucrative business. A lot of subdivision work going on. The titles were not difficult to research, and the research was necessary for the issuance of policies of title insurance. Also about that time, I was appointed, while in private law practice, as an assistant district attorney for Davidson County to prosecute criminal cases. And so in a short time, I had a full plate. Sanford was a brilliant lawyer. He had been an academic star at Vanderbilt. And your father had recognized that early on. Might tell you how your father recruited him to work before he became governor. He was having lunch with George Lewis, who was a Memphis lawyer. And Lewis, who was an officer who was at Waring, Walker, Cox and Lewis, a law firm in Memphis, was bragging about this brilliant young man they had hired to work in the Waring law firm. And Governor Clement excused himself from lunch and went to a pay telephone and called the office of George Lewis and asked to speak to Mr. Sanford, and said, "Sanford, will you come up to Dixon, Tennessee to meet with me and my father? We want to talk to you about a job." Never met Sanford. Sanford came to Dixon, met with Robert Clement and met with Frank Clement, and they hired him away from Memphis. And for the rest of his life, Governor Clement profited greatly from the work that Bell Sanford did in the law firm and otherwise.
Now, in the law firm of Clement, Sanford, and Fisher, most of your representation was in the civil arena. But while you were there, you were also the part-time prosecutor for the DA's office. What was that like, particularly? How did you get your files? When did you know your case, what your cases were, and how do you prepare your witnesses?
This will make you shudder. There were 3 part-time Nashville lawyers who were prosecuting all of the cases in the criminal courts.
And they were the felony cases, right?
Felony cases, all the felony cases, and some misdemeanors. A lot of the misdemeanors were handled in the General Sessions Court. But Howard Butler and Bob Warner and myself were the 3. We had, one year, we figured we had about 2,400 cases to dispose of. There were 2 criminal courts operating at the time. That meant of necessity that you made plea bargain arrangements with a great many of the defendants. Otherwise, there would have been no way for each of us to dispose of about 800 cases a year, part-time. We would prepare for trial on capital cases and very serious crime cases, although not in any great depth. Otherwise, the routine was this. We'd go into court. There would be a stack of files on the prosecutor's table. It might be a foot high. There might be 15 or 20 of them. We would never have seen the file before court opened at 9 o'clock in the morning. Never have seen any of them on most days. The room would be full of the lawyers for the defendants who were set for trial that day and of the defendants themselves. The room would be packed with witnesses who had been subpoenaed for each of those trials in that court on that day. The witnesses would have been determined by a secretary in the office of the Attorney General, of the District Attorney, a very skilled woman whose name was Pauline Bateman. And she was good. She could tell which witnesses were needed, and she would have arranged to subpoena them and get them to court. She might have had a little help from an investigator that the office employed, a man named John Cole. But when the assistant district attorney would get to court, he would simply pick up the file at the top of the stack, look through it quickly. Very little paperwork in most of the trials. Copy of the indictment, maybe the names of witnesses, a little 1-paragraph summary about what the facts were, maybe 2 paragraphs, never more than a page that I remember. And you'd peel off that top file and call the lawyer for the defendant to come over and talk to you a minute, and you'd offer him a deal. If it were a burglary case, you might offer him a lesser offense of larceny. You know, if it were a robbery case, you might offer him burglary. You'd offer him something less than he might get if he were convicted of the crime of which he was accused. And you were able to settle most of those cases by doing that. That process went very rapidly because after you had offered that deal to the first lawyer, you'd pick up the second file and call the next guy over, and you'd keep going, and they'd be all talking at the same time. They'd come back and say, yes, I'll take this deal, I won't, or bargain with you a little. Usually you'd get to one that wouldn't settle. They wouldn't take your deal, they demand a trial. At that point, you advise the judge, maybe it's 10 o'clock by now, you advise the judge, we're ready, Your Honor, to try such and such a case. Hadn't seen the file yet. Oh, except right then. At that point, the judge would excuse all the witnesses that had been called in all the cases that weren't going to get tried. And he would give the assistant district attorney about 15 minutes to meet with the witnesses. You'd call the witnesses from the back of the courtroom, meet them for the first time, take them into a little room and find out what they were going to say, and you'd start the trial. It wasn't a very good way to achieve great lawyer-like results, but we won nearly all the time. The facts were strong. They didn't typically send weak cases to be tried. But we disposed of about 2,400 cases a year with 3 lawyers part-time. I've forgotten how many lawyers they have over there now, well over 100, maybe 150 or 60 lawyers doing the same thing. Of course, they have a lot more paperwork now. They have some discovery. We didn't have any of that.
How long would it typically take to try a criminal case back then?
Well, it was commonplace for those cases to go to the jury and be done within a day. We had many, of course, that would carry over 2 or 3 days. I don't remember any. I can't think of a case that took longer than 3 days, although I might be forgetting one.
Even though some of them were capital cases.
Yes, the facts were usually very, very straightforward. The easiest criminal case I ever had, the easiest capital case I ever had to try was a murder case. I remember the name of the defendant, about the only defendant's name I remember from those days, but her name was Mary Easley. She was a black woman, and she had been chasing her husband with a butcher knife in her hand, and her husband tripped and fell down flat on the ground, face down. She jumped on his back with a butcher knife, and as she was stabbing him with a butcher knife repeatedly, she yelled, "Die, die, die, you black son of a bitch." And I had several witnesses who saw the whole thing. So Mary Easley's trial was over probably by midday. Bob Lillard, a great black lawyer, defended her. And Bob told me that the 20 years that she got was the longest sentence in a murder case that he knew of where one black person had killed another. And he thought it was outrageous that she was sentenced to 20 years. But he also later told me, I think he was the one that told me, that Mary Easley had gotten out early, had killed somebody else, went back to prison, had gotten out early again, and killed a third person.
Prior to this time, as Bob Lillard, who later became Judge Lillard, suggested? Was it the typical situation where a black-on-black crime usually resulted in a lighter sentence than a black-on-white or white-on-white?
I do not remember trying any murder case in which the parties were racially mixed. And I did not have enough murder cases that I had a sense of a pattern. But other lawyers who had tried a lot of criminal cases for a lot of years said that it was rare for a black person to be sentenced more than 10 years for murdering another black person.
How many years did you serve as a part-time prosecutor, and during that period of time, how many jury trials do you think you conducted?
Well, I started in 1959, I believe, and did it until 1962. I thought I had to leave in 1962 because of the gubernatorial. I wanted to do some work in the gubernatorial campaign, and it would have conflicted with my district attorney duties. I can't give you any accurate figure as to how many jury cases I tried, but often there were several in the course of a week. I was not in court every day. There were 3 of us to cover 2 criminal courts, and that allowed those of us who had civil work, if we had a conflict, one of the other district attorneys would cover for him. During that time, we just tried them back to back. We did not try them in the summertime. That was my only great disappointment with the system at the time. The criminal judges would not hold court in the summertime, and the only reason they could give was, we've never done it. Earlier, the courthouses had not been air conditioned. People had to get the crops in the summer, and it was just a custom for criminal courts to suspend in the summer. But these criminal courts, they'd leave people in jail who couldn't make bond all summer, while the criminal judges followed their customary pattern and suspended trials in the summer. So I was not trying cases back in the summertime, but otherwise I would be in court more days than not, and probably in that period of time tried well over 100 jury cases.
Was that your proving ground to become a trial lawyer?
Well, it got me a lot of experience that I would have been unlikely to have the opportunity to have otherwise. It got me acquainted with a lot of lawyers, got me acquainted with some judges. I became known. The community of lawyers was very much smaller at that time, and everybody knew who the district attorneys were. A lot of civil lawyers had a few criminal cases too. So it was a great training experience. It was helpful in getting me known.
Do you have an estimate of the number of lawyers practicing full-time in the Nashville legal community in 1962 and 63?
Not more than 400, probably, maybe 450. Earlier, I've heard other lawyers estimate lower figures, but I think there were probably that many about that time.
You indicated that in 1962 you wanted to help Governor Clement run for the governor's office again, and you did that, and he won. But this time you did not go back to work in the governor's office. What did you do after that? The firm of Clement, Sanford, and Fisher had been in existence from 59 to 63. Where do you go from there?
Val Sanford and I both determined we wanted to stay in the private law practice. Of course, Val had always been in the private law practice. I had always wanted to be a trial lawyer, and I thought, now I'd better get with it or try to. So Sanford and I continued as partners under the firm named Sanford and Fisher for a time after Governor Clement was reelected and after he went back into office. That took probably for not as much as a year, but maybe for a year or so. And Sanford got a very lucrative job offer from the firm of my old friend Weldon White. Weldon White had left the firm to go on the Tennessee Supreme Court. Harry Phillips had left that firm to go on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. And B.B. Gullett was left over there with a lot of lucrative, important law practice, and he needed some big-time talent to step in and fill it. And Sanford left and went with the Gullett law firm, where he practiced for the rest of his life.
That firm was Gullett and Sanford originally, and then Gullett, Sanford, Robinson, and Martin.
At one time called White, Farrell, Gullett, and Phillips, I believe, some such name. And it went through several names. But Weldon White was the head of that firm until he went on the Supreme Court. That left me as a solo. I did for a short time have one associate, Bobby Shoulders, who took a job with a telephone company as a lawyer and left me as a solo. And I was feeling a little lonesome at the time, but it turned out, instead of being an adverse move for me, it was a very positive move, because a lot of the clients that the firm had stayed with me, and my income shot up dramatically. I soon became overwhelmed with work. I began to get work from some work that was sent my way by Governor Clement, and I began to get some work from insurance companies, and kept some of the work from Guarantee Mortgage Company running titles. So I had quite a lot to do, and soon had to get some help.